I grew up in an anti-socialist family, a family that was really freaked out when I went to college. I was the first generation to go to college, and I remembered from my history textbook in 6th grade about Eugene Debs. And all I remember is the textbook said, Debs had some ideas about Social Security, and later on, some of those ideas were placed into the New Deal. And I always found that fascinating. I thought that was the extent of it, honestly. I grew up in a coal mining town, and certainly I didn't think that anything that had ever happened in that coal mining town was radical or had anything to do with socialists. It was Freeburg, Illinois, which is a town near about 15 miles southeast of East St. Louis. And later on, when I started reading and researching about Illinois history, I found out that it not only had a vibrant socialist movement, it had a vibrant radical labor movement. There was an actual local of the industrial workers of the world there. It was shocking to me, and I thought, oh, you know, I've been robbed of a kind of understanding of something that happened in my little, what I thought, my little podunk town that I should just leave. Later on I found out that this town was part of a march for a living wage in 1897 that helped to establish the United Mine Workers in Illinois. And at that time, the Illinois mine workers were radical. Hence, one of the reasons that Mother Jones is buried in Illinois. Mother Jones being one of the preeminent socialists and preeminent labor activists. I visited Mother Jones' gravesite in the midway through the Reagan administration, right, with a group of trade unionists. I was active in the labor movement at the time, had been introduced to that before I really knew anything about the history. And people gathered around the Mother Jones Monument and whispered that maybe the labor movement had gone wrong and that they maybe should take a little bit of a clue from the socialist project early on. And that really was what got me interested in labor history, standing around there with a group of activists and actually thinking about what path we were taking. If you don't know the history of the Reagan administration, this was the administration that really lit into the labor movement and suggested that, number one, we didn't need the labor movement, and secondly, that everything that was being accomplished with the end of the Soviet Union was a good thing, and that we had to have a more robust free enterprise system. They didn't talk about the word capitalism then. We didn't use that word because it was too harsh of a word. So we didn't use both these terms that I think we as citizens and certainly as teachers should understand. You know, the history of capitalism and the history of the challenges to it. So I'm just going to take this little piece, which is the challenges to it, and the history of socialism in the United States. Until about 2011, mostly people just said this was a thing of the past. You know, at the time I was teaching, and I kept noticing these Gallup polls that showed a rising trend of people saying they really liked socialism. And I kept thinking to myself, where did this come from? Because there is nothing in our culture that would suggest a dialogue or a discourse about socialism. And I've been, you know, struggling with that. Like, where did young people, where did people of color and, you know, the cohort of people who most favor socialism are young people and people of color. If you're a young Latino or a young African American, your tendency to dislike capitalism and favor some form of socialism, at least in these polls, kept growing. And then, of course, the Occupy movement happened, and things, you know, the challenge to Wall Street became part of our discourse. And ever since then, you can see this uptick. Certainly Bernie Sanders and his campaign have made the word part of a discourse. But what I'm saying is it started to happen before that. But mostly what people say is, this is a foreign import. You know, they still say that. They say that about Sanders. He's borrowing ideas from Denmark. He's borrowing ideas from the Nordic countries, and this can't be translatable to the United States. So what I want to introduce tonight is the United States as being one of the foremost progenitors, or the area that helped to build a global socialist project over a century ago, or in an earlier period. Let's see. So I don't know if that, now that I'm worried about that font, for you in the back, you know, you might not be able to see it. But, you know, my students and most people, you know, when Bernie Sanders tries to define socialism, it makes me a little crazy. Because he's, you know, you can still see that he's adjusting to all the ideas. He says, well, Roosevelt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt is my style of socialism. Economic Bill of Rights, he says a lot of this. And there's a reason that this is a little confusing, because socialists were radicals, but socialists were also reformers. So the combination of those makes it possible for Bernie to say, yeah, I'm like FDR. I just want to use the state. I want to challenge the state to provide health care. We can look at this long stream of history and say, yeah, what Roosevelt did was influenced by these more radical movements. And so they did, you know, the socialists did help change the course of history, and they took a lot of different approaches to how that change would come about. And I'll talk about that. So over time, you know, they believed a lot of things, and there was a spectrum of what they believed. Some of them, you know, held out for revolutionary possibilities, almost without fail, with a few exceptions. They thought of socialism as democracy extended to the economy. There was this term that was used in the 19th and early 20th century that's been lost, the hope that we could have a commonwealth that was cooperative instead of based on competition. I think it's really hard for us in this day and age, compared to them in the past, to get our heads around the idea that you might be able to organize all of society, to eliminate competition and to bring about cooperation among people. But that was the reigning idea in the past. The other thing that is really in line with Bernie is, at least his theory of change, is that he argues that workers should be empowered, and that is something that runs through the whole thread from revolutionary to reformer, and you know, why so many socialists were involved in the labor movement and wanted, you know, tried to take over the labor movement in some cases, or at least influence it. And the other is, and this could be reformist or radical, is that it was the idea of challenging the concentration of wealth. So this might shock you, especially if you know about Glenn Beck. I couldn't remember his name. You know, in the Tea Party, if you recall, most of you, I hope, are old enough to remember how they tried to take hold of Tom Paine as the forebearer of the Tea Party movement. And in fact, the truth is that Paine was considered by most socialists from the 1830s, really, through the 1950s, when Howard Fast, a communist, wrote Citizen Tom Paine, the first real expose in redemption of Tom Paine. And I would say radicals from Mother Jones, Eugene Debs, they all hearkened to Paine as the first American socialist. So one of the things that socialists did was try to claim an American heritage. And they saw